is on possible priorities and outcomes in the Trade and Investment Working Group. To chair this session, we have with us Mr. Gaurav Pundir, who is the Deputy Secretary, G20 Cell, Department of Commerce, Government of India. Among the speakers, we have Dr. Rupa Chanda, who is the Director, Trade, Investment and Innovation Division, UNESCAP, joining us online. Professor Chanda, just checking if you can hear us.
Yes, I can.
Great, thank you. Also on the dais, we have Dr. Harsha Singh, who's the former Deputy Director General at the WTO, and Dr. Radhicka Kapoor, who's the Senior Visiting Fellow at ICRIER. We also have two discussants joining online, Dr. Jong Kang, who's the Principal Economist, Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department, Asian Development Bank. Dr. Kang, if you could kindly confirm that you can hear us.
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you.
Great. And we have Dr. Zia Qureshi, who is the Senior Fellow, Global Economy and Development, the Brookings Institute. Has Dr. Qureshi joined?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Also joining us online is Dr. Peter Morgan, who is the Senior Consulting Economist and Advisor to the Dean ADBI. Peter, hope you can also hear us.
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Over to Gaurav for moderating the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, and I welcome all of you to this last, but to my mind, the most important session, because we do take a lot of pride in saying that within the Sherpa track, there are 13 working groups, and ours is kind of, crown in the jewel, because we, Department of Commerce and the Trade and Investment Working Group, has always been pioneer, not only within the G20 platform, but elsewhere also. And it cuts both ways in the sense that the stakeholders also look at us with intent and keenness that what will be the deliverables and outcomes in the working group. So it's a lot of responsibility on us, and as the speakers before us have already, kind of articulated that we are taking over the presidency in really fraught times. And to discuss that and what could be the priorities on which the Indian G20 presidency could work, we have amongst us, as already been introduced, Dr. Harsha Singh and Dr. Radhicka Kapoor and Dr. Rupa Chanda, who is joining us online. All three of them are quite distinguished, I would say, experts in the field, and have been working and contributing to the discussion in the realm of international trade at various forums. So I would say lay down what the thinking within the department is, and in terms of the priorities and what could be the possible deliverables, and then I will, kind of hand over to the experts to have their views and all, and then followed by what the discussants have to say on that. So as in the government, I will stick to a prepared text, because, we represent the government and their thinking. So I would say that I've organized my thoughts for around 5 minutes duration. So what is the context, and what India is thinking, what are our views, and how we want to achieve that. So I would say that the global trade and investment regime are under unprecedented strain on account of the pandemic, a raging war which is ongoing, and the attendant geopolitical tensions, and the steady weakening of the multilateral trading system as well. The deep interconnections underpinning the current globalized world have aggravated the adverse consequences of pandemic by imposing significant and widespread social costs on global economies. And the COVID-19 shock further disrupted global supply and demand and caused a prompt decline in investment all across the world. Now, the path to recovery from the pandemic was already slow and fragile. But the recovery has been further complicated by the supply shocks triggered due to the fraud, geopolitical tensions, and other issues that we are into. And as we know, it is estimated that the countries accounting for about 1/3 of the global economy would contract during 2023. So indeed, when we say that we are in amidst crisis, so there are numbers and it's really ominous. It looks like quite ominous. And the global growth is also tipped to slow down significantly to 2.7%, which was 6% in 2021. So, but it's nevertheless incontrovertible that globalization has caused widespread affluence by driving economic growth around the world. The expansion of international trade over the years has led to significant economic growth, innovation, and prosperity. So thus enhanced and deepened globalization and interconnections remains a viable solution for a strong, inclusive, and lasting economic recovery, not from the current crisis alone, but from the future crisis that perhaps the world would see maybe more often. But again, I mean, let's be realistic. So, as the latest outlook of the World Trade Organization estimates that owing to multiple shocks weighing on the global economy, trade growth will remain subdued across 2023 after losing momentum in the remaining part of 2022. So the current times require careful consideration of the key issues. While on one hand, we are hopeful that international trade is the way forward. At the same time, there are multiple we see waves of protectionism across the world. So that sets the context for our working group. So we strive to build a shared understanding of the challenges and opportunities facing the world economy. And there is a need to develop capacity to anticipate, evaluate, and manage risks better to build economic resilience. So in this larger framework, I would say that we at the Trade and Investment Working Group are thoughtful of these challenges and are kind of contemplating and planning to organize our agenda or our work during our presidency into largely two parts. So some of the priorities would be ongoing, like you see reforms in the World Trade Organization or the global trade governance issues, if I would put it, or how trade is still important for growth and prosperity, where we try to interconnect trade with SDG and the larger objectives on that, as Vice Chairman Niti Aayog also articulated. But at the same time, we would be discussing, or we will be putting across the table for all the G20 countries more contemporary issues in terms of how to make GVCs resilient, how to integrate MSMEs into international trade, and how to make logistics more efficient for them. So as you would see, perhaps the agenda would be a mix of a continuum as well as incremental progress that India can offer, realizing that while the global trade governance is a fraught issue and countries have their own strict positions, and so has India too. But at the same time, we do feel that the other three issues perhaps that we would think over, we can build consensus both across developing and developed countries. So why these issues are important? In short, I would say that one flows into the other, I would say. So trade for growth and prosperity is kind of an overarching umbrella. And then we know that international trade now is predominantly done through GVCs, global value chains. Now, global value chains are now dominated by multinational enterprises. So that means that we need to connect MSMEs into that, because if you are not connecting them to GVCs, then you can't connect them to the international trade. And to achieve all these objectives, you require efficient logistics. So this is how it fits into each other. And then looking at trade governance issues, that's certainly set the ball rolling for all of us. And we have kind of what if I would ask if I would pose the question what India wants. So we know it's quite a unique time, because for the first time in the G20 history, the Troika will be composed of the three developing countries. So Indonesia, India, and Brazil. So this is the time to really push through the priorities of developing countries, which we do feel that that they have not got their due in the forum so far. So this is a really opportune moment for India as well to really champion the cause of developing countries and global south. But at the same time, we also feel that without bringing developed countries on board, we can't go that far, because we need their partnership, we need their support in whatever objectives or whatever outcomes we propose during our presidency. So we want say, so for some of the outcomes, say we want to leverage digital ecosystem. Many speakers talked about India's exploits in this field. The world is recognizing, be it UPI, be it Aadhaar. I would also add the ONDC one, so which is a really revolutionary concept. We perhaps would try to kind of project it not only a product which is of the Indian origin, but as one which can do good for the entire world. So this is how we at the Trade and Investment Working Group intend to plan our work and plan our outcomes during our presidency. And with that background, I would straight go to my speakers who would have more wisdom to throw and what could be our priorities. And I would invite Dr. Rupa Chanda first, because I see them in that order. So I would invite her first with her thoughts on what could be our priorities.
Thank you very much. Good evening to everybody. And a special thanks to ICRIER for giving me this opportunity to participate in this session and share some thoughts on how India can frame the agenda and shape the discussions under this particular working group. Let me start with what my view is regarding the overarching objective of this working group, both from a G20 perspective and from the Indian perspective. The broad objective, I think, would be to use this platform to enable a better understanding of key developments and issues concerning trade and investment flows, and to use the understanding to forge a consensus on how to leverage emerging opportunities and address challenges. If this understanding can result in some important resolutions or declarations regarding principles and good practices to be followed, or frameworks that can be developed, those would be very important outcomes. They would be a signal to markets and could also inform discussions in other international forums, including the multilateral trading system. Specifically from India's perspective, as was just mentioned, it's a golden opportunity with the Troika consisting of 3 emerging markets. It's a chance for India to not only carry forward the discussion on key issues from the Indonesian presidency, but to also provide leadership on issues that are relevant to developing countries and in a manner that's sensitive to the needs and interests of developing countries at large. India is critical for success on all major global issues. And so how we steer this presidency, how we cooperate, and the examples we can provide from India, such as on digital inclusion or trade facilitation, can be very critical. Now, let me come to the substantive part of my intervention, which I would like to structure in 3 parts. The first is to just give some quick thoughts on a few selected priority issues and how specifically my organization, UNESCAP, would contribute. The second part of my intervention concerns a specific priority issue, which we were to work on initially and which has been dropped, which is how regional integration can be a building block for multilateralism. I would like to underscore still the significance of this topic in light of recent developments, as well as India's own geostrategic interests, how this could still be incorporated among the remaining priority issues. The third concerns certain themes which I believe India may want to cover under the priority issues, as they can place India in a strong leadership position and help it build on recent diplomacy gains. So let me start with the selected priority issues and some questions or aspects that I feel should be addressed under each, and the kind of specificity and focus required under them to deliver useful outcomes. So I've selected the issue on trade for growth and prosperity. In my view, at this point, it's much too broad and could cover anything pertaining to the role of trade in enabling growth and reducing poverty and inequality, such as the impact on labor markets and employment, access to essentials, productivity, technology, how do we look at emerging segments and opportunities, implementing reforms, overcoming market access barriers, and so on. So even though the issues note has narrowed down to 3 areas, SDGs, market access, particularly NTBs, and services trade, there's a need to reframe the question and structure the approach with specific focus on channels through which trade affects growth and prosperity. So I'd start by asking what kind of growth and what kind of prosperity are we talking about here? Perhaps one could reframe this issue by asking, how can trade and investment, because the word investment has been almost left out through most of the issue's notes, how can they enable more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient growth and development, and then examine the means through which this can be realized, perhaps by focusing on A, the role of trade and investment agreements, B, the role of cross-regional platforms like the G20 and others, and C, the role of domestic trade and investment policies, diversification strategies, and related reforms. One can then get into specifics and focus under each dimension. For instance, to explore the sustainability dimension, one could, for example, discuss how to make trade and investment climate smart by reducing technology and market access barriers to environment-friendly products and services, or through digitalization of trade, or by embedding of ESG principles in value chains. Likewise, for the inclusivity dimension, one could examine the linkages between trade and investment and women's participation or MSME integration, assess the bottlenecks in each case, and see how G20 cooperation can alleviate these challenges, provide lessons on good practices for sharing among G20 countries, and more widely. On the dimension of resilience, one could focus on ensuring trade and investment continuity in times of crises, maybe encourage discussion on developing principles or model provisions, or learning from good practices in regional and other agreements to prevent trade and supply chain disruptions and mitigating spillovers from crises, using the G20 platform to disseminate these lessons and possibilities. So overall, I would reframe the approach to this priority issue. SDGs are an objective that trade and investments should serve, so they're a goal, while reducing market access barriers like NTVs are a means to achieve trade that is inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. Likewise, services trade and how broad-based we make it, how we facilitate it, how we seize new opportunities, say in digital services, and address the challenges, can be a means to diversify and achieve quality growth and prosperity. Hence, some redrafting of this priority issue would help in terms of outlining what is the broader framework and end goal, and separately, what are the mechanisms to attain that end goal. And within each goal, one could consider specific issues such as environment and health as key global and regional public goods that are closely linked to the SDGs, gender, youth, and MSME engagement in the context of inclusivity, and model agreements and principles in the context of resilience. This would bring more focus and concreteness to the discussion and ensure tangible outcomes while separating out goals from means. These are all relevant beyond the G20 membership for developing countries at large. Now, coming to how UNESCAP could potentially contribute, well, in many different ways. These include its work on digital and sustainable trade facilitation under the Cross-Border Paperless Trade Agreement, its 2021 Asia-Pacific Trade and Investment Report on climate-smart trade and investment, our work with the WHO on trade and health, with a focus on ensuring equitable and affordable access to vaccines, the Sustainable FDI Indicators, which aim to promote investment to realize the SDGs, ongoing work on FDI and gender, as well as on digital trade and FDI, recent work on model provisions in times of crises, and analytical work on trade agreements and inclusion of sustainable development provisions. So depending on the ministry's interests, we can contribute to one or more of these various areas under this priority issue. The other issue that I'd like to discuss is logistics for trade. The issues note discusses the importance of cooperation to reduce logistics costs, investment in related infrastructure, and using data exchange platforms, etc. To this, I would add undertaking a review of the problems that have been highlighted by the pandemic and the recent Ukraine conflict, such as concentrated supply chains, unpredictability in timelines and procedures in the logistics ecosystem, lack of regulatory harmonization, among others. The note could focus on identifying specific points for action that require cross-border cooperation and understanding among leading countries, such as G20 members, not only through the G20 forum, but also through cooperation chapters in trade agreements and other forums where G20 countries are participants. Some action points could be digitalization of trade and related mutual recognition and acceptance of paperless trade for trade facilitation, advancing regulatory cooperation and harmonization of standards and protocols, interoperability of logistics systems across countries, focusing on sustainable logistics, ensuring efficient and uninterrupted supply of critical goods and supplies, and expedited logistics during crises, and exchange of best practices. Another very important aspect of this priority issue on logistics is the role of the private sector, especially industry associations, major logistics players, shipping lines, freight operators. The buy-in of the private sector and industry-government cooperation on aspects like information and data exchange, interoperability of standards, and any new platforms that are created will be key for any progress on trade logistics. So the issues note could explicitly highlight the role of the private sector, including how steps taken by operators in the logistics sector in the last 2 years helped ensure resilient and efficient supply chains, and in overcoming challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also in supporting growth in trade more recently. It could also highlight government initiatives such as India's Gati Shakti, which will benefit the logistics sector through investments across ports, multimodal terminals, etc. One could also examine opportunities for startups in logistics and trade facilitation. So I think it would be very useful to offer examples of good public sector practices in logistics management and in engaging the private sector in logistics planning and policy-making processes, with the objective of highlighting some principles and collaborative mechanisms for industry-government cooperation. Also, in order to benefit developing countries at large, the issue note could address how G20 members can play a lead role in facilitating multimodal transport connectivity and logistics to ensure supply of critical items to vulnerable landlocked countries which have experienced serious challenges during recent crises. Again, ESCAP has many potential contributions to make. We have, for instance, again, the implementation of the Framework Agreement on Facilitation of Cross-Border Paperless Trade, which is projected to lower trade costs by over 13% on average across the region. There are many other areas. In the interest of time, I won't go into those. Now, let me come to the second part of my intervention, which is on the priority issue that's been dropped on regional integration as a building block for multilateralism. While I'm not arguing for this to be reintroduced, it's still important to recognize the significance of regional integration in today's trade and investment landscape. Between the national level, which often takes on an insular character, and the global level, which is often unwieldy and poses challenges for forging a consensus, lies the regional, where many transboundary issues can be best addressed through cooperation, and where new templates and approaches can be piloted and implemented. For instance, RTAs often establish new benchmarks, address new issues, involve new institutional mechanisms and negotiating modalities, thus providing an opportunity for learning by doing, confidence building, and domestic reforms. These can potentially strengthen the multilateral trading system and lead to declarations and resolutions in other international forums. So my suggestion would be not to lose the regional perspective when addressing priority issues. For instance, under priority issue 1, one can ask if there are lessons to be learned from regional agreements and frameworks to which G20 member countries are party, which address NTBs, sustainable development provisions, digital trade, cooperation during emergencies and crises. The regional lens can help to identify good practices within and across regions, provide guiding principles and successful frameworks and templates. Analyzing regional processes and cooperation in relevant areas such as environment, health, trade facilitation, logistics, NTBs can inform the G20 deliberations. The G20 is, after all, a cross-regional clustering of key countries. And so it's an ideal platform to learn from bilateral and plurilateral agreements that exist both within and across regions where G20 countries are members. Let me also add that for India, the regional lens remains important for geostrategic reasons, as India is engaged in or negotiating agreements with or entering into frameworks that involve several G20 members. I know it's challenging, but giving a regional dimension to the discussions can help India clarify its stand on many emerging issues. Coming to the last part of my intervention, I'd like to highlight two sub-themes which should be covered. One of these is the role of trade, investment, and technology transfer in addressing health security. The Indonesian presidency had a separate priority issue on this. While we don't need a separate priority issue, given that it's a matter of great importance to developing countries, G20 cooperation to ensure smooth trade and investment flows in essential health products and pandemic preparedness for the future should be covered under relevant priority issues, especially issue 1. Further, given India's important role in supplying vaccines to developing countries and in the debate on TRIPS flexibility, the G20 presidency offers a great opportunity to table the agenda on IP, health technologies, and trade, and to strengthen India's leadership position on vaccine diplomacy. Another topic I would suggest is digital trade, which, though controversial and challenging for India, should be covered given its cross-cutting relevance across many of the priority issues. It's relevant for inclusive trade, for better logistics, for sustainability, for MSME integration, and even the future of the multilateral trading system and reforms. Given India's competitiveness in digital trade, especially digital services trade, this topic deserves special attention. 3 final points in closing. First, as most of the priority issues are interrelated, it's important to ensure certain key aspects are covered across the priority issues to arrive at an integrated and cross-cutting understanding. Some examples of these are trade facilitation, digitalization, and MSMEs, which require a holistic and synergistic understanding. I'd also suggest looking across working groups, for instance, the working group on health, climate, digital, to better understand linkages across sectors. The pandemic has clearly highlighted to us the multi-sectorality of issues confronting the world today, and therefore it will be important not to remain within individual working group silos. Second, there's a need to ensure that discussion on both trade and investment is balanced and doesn't become a predominantly trade-led analysis under each priority issue. The nexus between trade and investment should be captured as the two are increasingly intertwined in today's world. Last but not least, as a leading developing country, India should ensure that whatever approach is taken must be balanced, one which recognizes market needs alongside concerns of national sovereignty and domestic capacity, and thus is sensitive to the needs of the wider group of developing countries. Let me conclude here. Thanks for this opportunity to share my thoughts on the way forward for this working group. I wish the group and all knowledge partners success in shaping the agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chanda, for your insights and your comments. We will be certainly mindful of them as we progress in giving final shape to our priority issues. I would now request Dr. Harshvardhan Singh with his comments on the way forward for the Trade Investment Working Group.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to ICRIER, and also thanks to Dr. Rupa Chanda for a very substantive input. I'll start from the kind of issues or points which she has highlighted, that in this process, one needs to develop, identify the relevant principles, learning from others, mechanisms which are relevant, identify them, cross-sectorally recognize the links, and review problems which are highlighted due to, say, COVID or some international emergencies, and the solutions are multidimensional. Therefore, the effort to address them should also be multidimensional. In that context, and she's addressed a large number of issues which you had highlighted for the trade and investment context. I will then go on straight to WTO reforms, because in the WTO context, it's a framework which actually covers these various concerns together, but at the same time, there is a major concern of the members that the system is not functioning properly and needs to be improved. As far as I will address it in 5 different short segments: the importance of WTO, need for reform, the positive contribution of India to the success of the 12th Ministerial Conference of WTO in June, and how that provides a basis for India to be a good coordinator to address WTO reform in ongoing initiatives, including in G20, and main elements of the framework that could be considered in this context. So many people, they forget when a system is functioning and creating opportunities, they actually don't see the value of that. An example is the traffic light system. Just imagine traveling without a traffic light system. And we in India have good experience in that. And then look at how things are facilitated. You travel longer distances, take less time. So in my mind, WTO is the traffic light system of global trade. It enables a lot more trade to take place, which then leads to growth, however you define it, because WTO is about trade issues, and you have to supplement it with domestic policy to improve the quality of that. Actually, the Declaration on 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it notes the significance of SDGs. It actually talks about how significance of WTO to meet SDGs. It talks about how WTO meets certain SDGs. It emphasizes international trade as an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction. So the value of international trade and the fact that there is a multilateral institution which addresses, facilitates, enables much larger trade and thus investment taking place. That institution is a centerpiece in any effort which we need to do together through partnerships. And WTO is nothing but a partnership. And that partnership today is required even more than any other time, because the concerns which we face today, they require countries working together. So you need multilateral institutions to address problems which require multilateral solutions. And WTO is one such institution. So at a time when it is needed the most, people have found it needing also improvement in its functioning. And some parts of it are actually broken. So there is a need for WTO reform. Normally, when you talk about WTO, people talk about three pillars of WTO. These are negotiations, implementation, and enforcement. Negotiation is clear. You negotiate an agreement. Implementation is how through the various bodies of the institution, like committees, etc., you actually take whatever you have negotiated and give it shape and form and implement it on the ground with other countries or individually. And enforcement is when some country feels that its rights are being violated. It can actually come and raise a concern which could turn into a dispute, and there is a system to address that dispute. So today, the enforcement part is broken as it was established in WTO, because the two-tier appeal process does not function. So that's one of the areas to address it. The second is improvements in notification, transparency in WTO agreements. So this is the implementation part. The members want it to be improved. Negotiating and concluding agreements. Today there is a concern that the negotiation part is also broken, because not all the members can come together on the same platform and begin to negotiate issues on which there is a common understanding of their importance. And improving the functioning of WTO's regular bodies and committees. So in some sense, all the three pillars which I talked about, they need reform. Reform means improvement. Reform doesn't mean that you change policies, etc. You come to some kind of an agreement. But there are two other aspects which are very important in the WTO context. One is capacity augmentation, where you work together to improve the capacities of those members who need to increase their capabilities to implement, negotiate, and even in terms of dispute settlement. And second is that there are certain foundational principles in the WTO context. And these are very important. In fact, the ministerial conference, the 12th ministerial conference outcome document, which means that the ministers actually agreed to that. There's a very important statement which says, while reaffirming the foundational principles of the WTO, we envision reforms to improve all its functions. So they reaffirm the foundational principles. What are they? They are non-discrimination, so most favored nation treatment and national treatment in technical terms, where when you treat any country, the best treatment you give to any country, you give to all, National treatment is that you treat the product which you are importing no less favorably than the treatment you give to your domestic product. So that keeps the level playing field operational. And then a consensus-based decision-making. That's also a foundational principle. And for developing countries, a special and differential treatment, flexibilities or lower obligations. These foundational principles are also under pressure within this context where the reform is needed for all aspects of WTO. So how do you then take it forward in a manner that the WTO starts functioning far more efficiently? And it's needed to do so because today more than before, I'm not thinking of 2008, etc., where again, in fact, G20 was activated in a very serious way. Today, more than ever before, we need the group of countries of G20 to come together to build, strengthen this institution, which is a multilateral institution. So in this background, and the fact that India's presidency of G20 is coming up, it is relevant that in the ministerial conference, actually, those who followed the negotiations, they say that India's engagement was very positive and India made significant contribution to the success of that negotiation. The 12th ministerial conference was a success, and one reason was India's very active and positive participation. India contributed significantly to and paved the way for this successful result. India engaged proactively with other ministers who had their own concerns in a number of areas, worked with them to create solutions that would address the various concerns, suggested specific solutions for situations where the process was not moving ahead, and collectively, the emphasis is collectively, help pave the way for successful outcome of the ministerial conference. So it actually has built a basis for continuing to seek further solutions in areas where there could have been a complete failure. So India, in this background, if I look at it, two important aspects come out.
Because we are waiting for the other speakers also.
Okay, you want me to close now? Yeah. Okay. Then I think with this background, India is a very good coordinator. What are the main elements of reform which one can think of? In the WTO, you could come up with something which is relevant, a tangible conclusion for the membership as a whole. This could be something which you develop as a response to international emergencies, such as pandemic, such as a health emergency. So you come up with the kind of principles, mechanisms, framework, which can be used and benefit from the experience of others in that context. Something like that could be established. A specific category of members like developing countries, where you enable them to better understand the new issues which are being negotiated or are being discussed, and also upgrade their capabilities in dispute settlement, because new forms of disputes are going to come. Then identify issues of higher priority for WTO members. If you see the debate on WTO reform, there are a whole lot of issues, but what are the key priority issues? How do you develop solutions for them? Could there be solutions which range from soft to hard law solutions? Some of the soft law solutions might be more easily achievable earlier. So trying to see a stepwise move along with these solutions. And in WTO itself, there are various ways in which, when there are differences of opinion, people have found landing zones. And the key part of WTO is there's a concept called adverse effects. you either something is prohibited or you act against something when there is adverse effects, which means that you don't need to act in every situations. So what are those conditions where you actually need to act? That way you will create some gaps and possibility of countries not being subject to obligations. And when you have that, you combine with that the flexibilities which have resulted in conclusions. These could be like the reference paper on telecom, where there are principles which are evolved and you voluntarily choose which principle to take, which not to take. And over time, you can increase the adoption of that list. So a voluntary nature of participation by those who are in a position to cause adverse effects, or who actually, if they are missing, would be resulting in larger gap in performance than if they are not missing. So it could be in terms of transparency, it could be in terms of various other concerns which arise. Similarly, longer period provided and agreed conditions that provide limited flexibility under the conditions which are agreed. So you can actually solve the tension which arises today for foundational principles, but the foundational principles must be maintained, because without that, it is not a multilateral institution. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for your insight. We understand that you have worked a lot on WTO issues, and we are also enthused that MC12, during the 12th ministerial, there were some good outcomes, and we really look forward, considering that our presidency is coming in between 13th MC and so that will be a good segue if we are able to deliver some outcomes on WTO reform issue, considering that it is one of the ticklish part for so far as our agenda is concerned. But thanks a lot for your comments. And now I would request Dr. Radhicka Kapoor to have her thoughts on how should working group proceed during our presidency. Dr. Kapoor.
Fact that I'm the last presenter of the day, and it's been a very, very long day. So I'm going to be quite brief, and thankfully the chair has already set the agenda and the background to this discussion. So that allows me the benefit of being brief. You've spoken, Mr. Pundir, about the key priority issues, some of which the Ministry of Commerce is going to be taking up, and ICRIER is delighted to be the knowledge partner for the Ministry of Commerce. And the theme I'm going to be speaking about today is integrating MSMEs into global trade, what role the G20 can play. And this is one of the areas that we're working on very closely with you, with Dr. Mishra, Tanu, and ICRIER is delighted to be a part of this conversation. What I'm going to do really is first emphasize the importance of the subject, why MSMEs need to integrate into global trade, why it is an important issue for India to take up as we assume the G20 presidency. And as many speakers have noted since the morning, this marks the first emerging market troika. I will briefly speak about what the conversation around MSMEs has been at the G20. It's a conversation which is of fairly recent origin. And then thirdly, what are the possible priority areas and outcomes we can look at? Because one of the things we've heard repeatedly since the morning from many of the key stakeholders in this process is that we want a very action-oriented presidency. So what we're aspiring for is that through our research, we actually put very concrete, actionable issues for you on the table to act on. So very briefly, before I jump into the subject, I do want to mention that the word MSMEs or MSMEs is widely used in the jargon. I mean, these acronyms are used very generically to refer to any firm that's not large. But it's important to highlight that there is a lot of diversity. There is a lot of heterogeneity within this group. It includes enterprises which have anywhere between 1 to 2 workers in traditional sectors, to firms having 40 to 50 workers or even up to 90 workers in very modern sectors. And in fact, there is no common definition of MSMEs. There are estimates from the International Finance Corporation that tell us that there are about 267 definitions floating around of MSMEs, and these are based on, it could be based on employment, on turnover, on your investment in plant and machinery. In fact, India also has had multiple definitions over the years, and now we've moved towards a new definition in 2020. So the conversation has, sometimes it becomes a little tricky to analyze this subject and actually create comparable statistics at the G20 level because of this issue of not having a definition which is accepted commonly by all the G20 countries. But of course, the two most commonly used definitions are one which is given by the World Bank and the other by the OECD. So some of the statistics that I will be presenting to you in the tables in the charts ahead essentially draw from these definitions. Now, apart from this issue of how you define them in terms of their size of employees or turnover and so on, another important issue in the MSME space is that of dualism, that there is a very stark formal informal divide. Many of the MSMEs, especially in the global south, the micro enterprises in particularly, are largely informal in nature. The small and the medium, you still find a few formal enterprises, but the issue of informality and formality is really very central to the subject of MSMEs. Now, as we all know, MSMEs, contribute a lot, and that is why they're such an important subject of conversation here, to national income, to employment. And here there's a graph over here which actually tells you what this is from OECD countries, which essentially points out their contribution to value added, to employment. But what it also shows you is that while they contribute significantly to national income and employment, their contribution to trade is relatively modest. For instance, across OECD countries, just 5 to 40% of MSMEs directly export, compared to 80% in the case of large firms. Separately, we have data from the WTO on developing countries that tell us that MSMEs exports represent just about 7.6% of manufacturing sales. And even for large manufacturing firms, frankly, that number is not very high. It's just 14%. So the problem of MSMEs being integrated in trade is across the developed and the developing world. But of course, it is more severe for MSMEs which are in the developing world. I could skip over this slide in the interest of time, but essentially this looks at the share of MSMEs in exports by size. And again, this graph simply drives home the point that it is the larger firms which have a greater share in exports compared to micro, small, and medium. Now, before we jump into this question of how we can help MSMEs integrate into global trade, it's important to understand that why are they not in fact integrated into global trade to begin with? And at the heart of this issue is really the problem of low productivity of the MSME sector. Large firms have higher productivity, and therefore they are able to tap into foreign markets, and they can grow even further through exporting. On the other hand, the MSMEs, which because of their low productivity, cannot enjoy economies of scale, cannot access, invest in machinery, in skilled labor, they can't coordinate their production activity better, they're not able to tap into international markets, and they're not able to expand further. And that has implications in terms of the kind of jobs they create, because when they're able to integrate with international markets, in particular GVCs, they're able to create better paying jobs. That process of integration, in fact, enhances their productivity and creates an organic channel for them to also formalize. And the subject of the formalization of MSMEs is also something which has captured a lot of attention, not just in India, but also globally. So there are enormous benefits that arise from integrating them. But at the heart of that, the root cause of that is their low productivity. And there's some graphs over here. The panel, which is on the left-hand side, basically looks at data from the ADB, which is, countries from Asia. And this highlights the differences in the value added per worker across firms of different sizes. And it's abundantly clear from here that larger enterprises have higher gross value added per worker. The panel, which is on the right-hand side, is the data from the World Bank's enterprise survey, which once again shows that it is larger firms that have average higher total factor productivity compared to MSMEs. And they're separately, more recently, McKinsey has come out with data which shows that even in in the developed world, there is a productivity gap between small and large firms. Now, of course, as we can see, the gap, the productivity differential is significantly larger in the developing world compared to the developed world, but it's nevertheless a subject which is increasingly, which needs to be addressed if we actually want SMEs or MSMEs to internationalize, to access export markets, to create better jobs. And that not only enhances their contribution to economic development, but also to social well-being. So in some sense, the integration of MSMEs in global trade is very critical to the discourse on inclusive growth and development. And not surprisingly, the G20 has actually had a very strong track record of advocating for greater integration of MSMEs in global trade. In fact, the conversation on integrating MSMEs in global trade started under the Turkish presidency in 2015 under the inclusive growth agenda. And then when the Trade Investment Working Group was formed in 2016, China took this up. The focus again was on the integration of MSMEs in global value chains, because global value chains are a very important factor which are shaping international trade. And they provide important opportunities for MSMEs to integrate into the global economy, either as exporters or as suppliers to large firms, or even as importers of inputs and technologies. So it's a subject which has very much been there. The conversation under the Chinese presidency was again about improving financial access. It was about digital trade, access to information. And that conversation has continued over subsequent presidencies. More recently, under the Saudi presidency, there were policy guidelines which were put forward on boosting MSMEs' international competitiveness. Under the Italian presidency, there was a non-binding policy toolkit on promoting MSMEs via focusing on digital MSMEs and entrepreneurship. So this is a subject, of course, which has been very much, which has become very popular in the discourse over the last few G20 presidencies. But it's one that we believe that as the Indian presidency, India assumes the G20 presidency, it's something that we should take up and also put forward, as I said before, very tangible, concrete outcomes that can eventually, in the long run, help MSMEs integrate in global trade. And of course, this discussion assumes importance not just because we are in some sense the voice of the global south, but also because in the post-pandemic world, we realize that MSMEs, and now there's enough data to show that coming from different organizations, that the trade effects of the pandemic have been particularly severe for MSMEs compared to large firms which are in the same sector in the same country. So the question that really arises is that what policies can G20 countries adopt individually and collectively to accelerate the participation of MSMEs in global trade? And given that, as I emphasized before, that a lot of this challenge is linked to the low productivity of MSMEs, the question, one way of framing how we tackle this problem is to ask that how can we enhance the competitiveness and the productivity of MSMEs, one, and second, how do we increase the connectivity or the means by which MSMEs can in fact connect into international markets and global value chains. And we believe that, the G20 is an important forum to look at, to provide international cooperation and global solutions to this challenge in an increasingly complex trading environment. So, when we talk about what is responsible for the low productivity of MSMEs, why are they not able to integrate? There are many, many challenges. And let me say broadly, there are some challenges which are internal to the firm. They are linked to the management, the workforce capability, the ability of the firm to adopt certain technologies, and so on. And, obviously, those are not issues that we touch on in the context of this discussion at the G20, but there are very many external challenges in terms of access to finance, access to information, access to technology, your trade policy. And these are subjects where we can, which we can put forward in our priorities to address at the G20. So of course, we've had several rounds of discussions on this, and we bucket them broadly into three groups. The first is access to markets. MSMEs are very often not able to tap into potential markets because they have very little information about, local rules and regulations, domestic.
I'm sorry, but you could just skip through that because because
Okay.
for the sake of time.
Okay, sure. So basically, I think to this audience, I don't need to elaborate on this, but we basically bucket it into three different groups: access to markets, access to finance, and technology. And of course, these are problems which are there even for large firms, but for smaller firms, given that trade costs involve a significant fixed component, they are particularly burdensome for SMEs, and that poses a challenge. Having said that, what we do, the good thing and the conversation that we've been having over the course of the day, which is about digital transformation and digitalization, tells us that because of these changes, these rapid technological advances, there is scope for reducing these trade costs to increase the involvement of MSMEs in trade. And that, in fact, alleviating these external constraints that are faced by the MSMEs will not just help in increasing their engagement in international trade, but also enhancing their productivity and alleviating some of the internal constraints they face. And the reason I'm emphasizing this repeatedly is to say that, a lot of stuff on the MSME side can be done at a forum like G20, but there are spillover benefits of that in domestic policy as well. So again, going back to this issue of the digital agenda, which has been overarching through the course of the day, and the FM and the Sherpa, everyone has highlighted this. The question that we put forward in the priority issues would be that how do G20 countries collaborate to leverage digital technologies to accelerate the integration of MSMEs in global trade? In particular, how can digital technology be leveraged to address issues of financial inclusion, access to information? And three things that we put forward here. One is, how can we actually collaborate to build technology-based tools that will allow collection, sharing, synthesis of financial information related to MSMEs from multiple sources, because at present that financial information is in a very siloed nature. Putting that together will not only help improving access to finance, but also establishing and assessing their credit worthiness, which is a challenge. The second is that, there is a big problem with the lack of equitable, affordable, and fair access to digital tools when it comes to MSMEs. They are disproportionately impacted there. So again, how can we collaborate amongst the G20 countries to address this problem? Because giving them that equitable, fair, and affordable access to digital tools will not only help them to connect to markets through digital platforms, but also help improve their business processes and in turn enhance the productivity and the product quality of the goods they are producing, which then allows them to integrate better with international markets. And finally, given the access to information, and we do understand that there is already a help desk, a global online help desk on this, but how can India further push the envelope on putting together, some sort of platform or tool that will improve MSME access to information by providing them real-time and very focused information on various, trade measures, information about markets, or a combination of trade and market-related research. So these are just three ideas that we have in terms of outcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your thoughts. We're really running really short of time. I think this is such a fascinating discussion that, 1.5 hours is not sufficient for that. But yeah, considering that we have so many experts waiting, I would now invite Dr. Jong Kang, who is one of the discussants, and I would request him to give his thoughts in 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Chair. All the three speakers, have laid out the stage for the India presence for next year, G20 presidency next year, in a very structured manner. I like the idea of putting the trade and investment agenda in the context of inclusiveness, resilience, and sustainability. And also, I'd like to let you know that our flagship publication, which is called the Asian Economic Integrity Report, the theme chapter next year will be on the trade and the climate change nexus, which will be published in February next year. So you might have a chance to refer to our report in working under the presidency. I'd like to highlight the importance of digital service trade. Compared to the manufacturing sectors, the services have have yet to grow further across the Asia and other developing countries, and in particular, digital service trade has shown quite the high degree of resilience during the pandemic for the parent regions that we all know. So also India, as a powerhouse of the IT and other business services, I think that country is in a very good position to advocate this digital service trade under its presidency. So the sector can cover IT, telecommunication business, financial research and development services, and telehealth, telemedicine, and online education, etc. So, but at the same time, we all know that globally, the digital service trade are under the higher regulatory barriers, and how to lower these barriers and how to forge consensus among the G20 countries could be one agenda that can be tackled. When it comes to the WTO, I don't think everything is in a sense dead. I mean, there are some movement going on underway at the moment. For example, plurilateral negotiation on e-commerce is a good example where the many G20 countries can express their strong support. Another one is the joint statement initiative on service domestic regulation. So this kind of plurilateral approach could be one agenda that the Indian G20 presidency can strongly support and delve into more details to make it more concrete outcomes in the near future. When it comes to the SME issue, I think that in the context of reconfiguration of the global supply chains, in the midst of the pandemic and in the midst of the trade, the conflict between the global heavyweights, among others, we tend to think that the multinationals at the front center of being affected from the reconfiguration of supply chains. But SMEs being connected to these big companies as a tier 1, tier 2, or even tier 3 suppliers, the ripple effect will be felt by SMEs eventually. So how can we support SMEs to adjust to the reconfiguration? I mean, the changing landscape of the global supply chain could be one issue that we need to discuss. And when it comes to the free trade agreement, bilateral or regional free trade agreement, having the more and more number of FTAs is one thing, but the implementation is another. I think that many developing countries are having a low capacity in complying with the FTA implementation. In particular, SMEs, due to the high compliance and administration cost. As I know that the utilization ratio of FTAs are even below 30% for the SMEs. So then how to provide capacity building opportunities and awareness enhancement opportunities for the SMEs. That's something that needs to be discussed at the G20 level, I think. And lastly, in the digital space, cross-border e-commerce will gain more momentum in the future. From the MSA's perspectives, market entrance barriers could be still very high because of the gatekeeper large platform companies are dominating the market power at the moment. So when it comes to the SMEs entrance to the digital market space, we cannot avoid discussing the competition policies and antitrust policy. For example, how to mandate the big gatekeeper large platform to share their customer data with the new entrants from the SME space, for example. So that kind of competition policy related issue could be one agenda that the G20 countries can tackle jointly. Thank you. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Kang, for your thoughts. And now I would request Dr. Zia Qureshi for his comments, and he also has 5 minutes to wrap up his thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to this event. The speakers in our session have made excellent presentations. There isn't the time to do justice to the richness of what each of them has laid out. So I will make 3 comments that broadly span the discussion. And I will focus my comments on how technology is changing trade, investment, and industry and related policy agenda. First, digital technologies are reshaping markets and transforming the growth and distributional dynamics within economies and between economies. And these transformations are particularly notable in the areas of trade, investment, and industry that we are discussing in this session. The pace of change in markets has been rapid, but public policy in general has lagged in responding to change. So a sizable policy or governance deficit or gap has emerged. This has meant that the potential of the new technologies is not being harnessed well. And indeed, some of the results have been perverse, such as falling rather than rising aggregate productivity growth in many economies and rising economic inequality. So public policy needs to catch up with change spawned by technology. Within economies, there are new challenges in competition and regulatory policies and digital services access to ensure that the benefits of the new technologies are not captured only by a few tech giants in increasingly monopolistic market structures, but are instead disseminated more widely across firms, including small and medium enterprises. There are new challenges in equipping the workforce with skills compatible with the new technologies. At the international level, new rules and cooperative arrangements must be devised to ensure open access and competition in the era of digital globalization, including adequate disciplines for digital trade, digitally deliverable services, digital intellectual property, tech giants and digital platforms that can affect competition across national markets, and taxation of cross-border digital business. The G20 offers an important platform to help steer this new agenda and mitigate the digital economy policy or governance deficit that I mentioned. The G20 can and should do more. My second point is that in much of our discussion here, explicitly or implicitly, the focus has been on manufacturing. Manufacturing is of course important, but in the digital era, services need to be brought more centrally into growth and development strategies. Dr. Kang touched on this in part. Digital technologies and automation are disrupting traditional pathways to growth and development. They pose new challenges to manufacturing-led growth strategies in developing economies. They will increasingly erode these economies' comparative advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing based on large populations of low-skill, low-wage workers as these tasks get increasingly automated. On the other hand, the new technologies open new opportunities in services by expanding the universe of tradable services. India has had some notable success in this regard. Domestically also, raising the productivity of enterprises engaged in services is important to developing economies, aggregate productivity, and longer-term growth performance. Service enterprises in these economies, which are predominantly small and medium enterprises, employ the bulk of the urban labor force, but in most cases at very low levels of productivity. So the services agenda needs more attention. And my third and final point is a suggestion. India should consider taking the opportunity of the G20 presidency to provide leadership on the policy agenda relating to the transformational effects of the new technologies on markets, economies, and globalization. The G20 during its recent presidencies has addressed aspects of digital transformation. It established a digital economy task force, but much of this discussion has been fragmented. Often the issues have been approached in a sectoral way, with technology being viewed rather narrowly as a sector, the IT sector, presenting IT issues such as regulation of data, cybersecurity, privacy, etc. This IT regulatory agenda is of course important, but as I mentioned, the digital revolution is having transformational effects on economies across the board, across sectors, across countries, and across policy domains. India, during its presidency, could raise the salience of this technology-driven economic transformation in G20 deliberations and approach it in a more integrated way, not just in one task force or a working group or on one track, but as a major cross-cutting force or theme shaping much of the forward public policy agenda, both within economies and at the global level. Given India's position as a leader in the developing world on the new technologies, it could also play the role of a bridge to bring developed and developing countries together on this transformational agenda. Digital transformation has major implications for the developing world, but much of the action in regulating the new technologies and how they affect trade, investment, industry, and international competition, much of this action is taking place in forums in the EU, the US, etc., where developing countries are not participants. The G20 can provide a more inclusive forum to help develop a governance regime for the new technologies that is more global and not fragmented by regional or country group interests. It can also help empower related multilateral institutions, such as the WTO, to address the new agenda. Dr. Singh in his remarks highlighted the importance of the WTO. The WTO needs to do more on this new agenda. In an interview recently published on Project Syndicate, WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala said, and I quote, "There are still no basic global trade rules for the digital economy," end quote. India's G20 presidency can be instrumental in moving this new agenda forward. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Qureshi, for your thoughts and comments. I'm afraid we don't have time for any Q&A now. So I would straight request Dr. Peter Morgan to present a summary of the session and propose a vote of thanks. Dr. Morgan.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I think it's been an extremely rich discussion and very difficult to summarize in just a couple of minutes. But I think it's obvious that trade and investment are the keys to growth. And it's been emphasized that we're not just talking about any kind of growth, but that which is resilient, inclusive, and sustainable, and is consistent with the SDGs. And in particular, there was a lot of discussion on, in terms of the issue of inclusivity, about how to integrate MSMEs into the GBCs, and tied in with that is the question of how to increase their productivity, because there's a bit of a vicious circle that as long as MSMEs have low productivity, then it's going to be difficult for them to participate in GBCs, and that will tend to perpetuate their situation of low productivity. And I think the discussion also highlighted the great potential of digitalization to perhaps break this vicious circle. And in particular, if the services trade could be more liberalized, that could be a great potential vehicle for increased digital trade. So that along with that, we saw issues of, for example, what could be the contribution of the WTO to addressing these issues more? What is the role of competition policy to also ease the access of MSMEs to this kind of technology? And most importantly, what is the role that India can take during the Indian G20 presidency to give more priority and provide perhaps a more unified leadership in this area of trying to promote digitalization. So let me stop there. I think it's been a very successful conference. I'd like to congratulate ICRIER for organizing it, particularly Dr. Mishra, Pratik Kukrija, and many others, plus of course all the presenters, discussants, and the keynote speakers. It's been our pleasure to support the G20 conference since 2010, and we look forward to a very successful Indian G20 presidency. Thanks very much.